So it just feels like it would make sense to start speaking a little bit about meeting life where it is, meeting each other where we are in all of this. And there is a lot of different ways to approach that, although we could say the point of contact. The way we can maybe start to play with that is an inquiry to ask, where does attention meet object, or where does attention meet attention? And pretty much with anything in our experience, we can start to examine that, even if it seems like it's externalized. So, for instance, in picking up this pen, well, that's kind of a cool effect. Whoa! In picking up this object and to touch what feels like a separate object, and to really bring all sense of attention into the pen and the fingertips, into the pen, into the fingertips, to see if we can find where that point of contact actually is in this experience, in the tactile aspect of it. Where is attention meeting attention? Maybe you have something nearby while you're watching this, and something that you can do as well. Start maybe by picking up the object and closing your eyes, holding it, and noticing the thought that wants to give you a visualization of what it is, and maybe noticing any sort of narration around it, and just move and touch and place on that object without doing too much to create definition, without putting any more intellectual effort into modeling the experience. We start to lose a sense of orientation. We start to realize that I cannot tell where pen touches me and I touch pen. And on a further note, or a little bit of deeper exploration, we start to recognize that there is some sort of overlapping occurring. And within that overlapping, we start to have another recognition that maybe I cannot decipher the boundary of where attention meets attention, where touch is touching, because there is no inherent boundary there. That within that overlapping, that maybe it is evidence that I am that. That might not have quite enough of a visceral pull for you. Yet, in these experimental aspects of how we approach this, we can start to have these overlaps all over the place on where we're meeting something or something is meeting us. And that will start to give you a sense of, if it can be experienced, then it must be me, but not me alone. Something here. So we can then kind of stretch that out a little bit and ask about our willingness to meet life where it appears. That can show up in a myriad and infinite form of ways, to meet experiences, these perceived events, to meet relationships, to meet sensations, to meet what appears to be the body, all of these things. Are you willing to go to that very point of contact? And so, if so, are you willing to experiment? Are you willing to challenge the conclusions that are already put into place by the mind? Are you actually willing to meet life where it appears, whatever that may be? Even now in the sound, if you're listening to this voice, this simple vibration that really doesn't have any meaning, it's simply just a variety of sounds. Where is the sound? Where is the voice meeting what is hearing? Where is hearing meeting hearing? Where is the attention meeting the attention? Notice all of the aspects of what's being stimulated while watching this video. Notice where the eyes move. Notice the frequency of blinking. Notice how often or quickly the eyes are moving in that experience. And just see if you can allow yourself to taper down the stimulation and hone in on maybe something that feels more singular in the aspect of experience, just the sound meeting sound, or what is seen meeting what is seen. And you will start to have a sense of a non-clear boundary. And you will start to recognize that the boundary is an assumption. It's seemingly something put into place before the engagement. But then as you begin to engage, you'll start to see something else occurring there, an overlapping. And in that overlapping, can you find what is what? Is there anything clearly defined in the arising of an experience in these expressions? Not really looking to stimulate an intellectual response here. This video is meant to be an encouragement to step into something much more direct and experiential. So even though there are words and details here, perhaps you can feel something more energetic underneath that maybe inspires a little, inspires a point of curiosity, inspires a little bit of investigation, something to come into contact with. You probably hear that term fairly often, to come into contact with it. What we're really asking you to do is to playfully and thoroughly examine this attention meeting attention, this actual point of contact. And sometimes that looks like a physical experience, or what we could regard as a externalized physical experience. Yet overall, the essence of this remains the same throughout everything. Because it really does seem as if everything is everything. Everything is everything. Everything is everything. Everything is everything. Yet if there's a little bit of a doubt there, and if you want to put this into a more curious exploration, you can simply ask, is everything everything? And that might begin to encourage you to look for maybe the vacancy or the vacuum of an experience. Is everything everything? Now you'll be looking for the exception. Can you find the exception of everything not being everything? And what you'll start to find is there's a least common denominator in all that, and we can just say that's simply the witness, the observer, the one who's perceiving, or the one who assumes there is one who's perceiving, so on and so forth. What's really interesting is, even on a much more scientific level, anything that exists will not appear unless there is a perceiver. I know that sounds maybe possibly confusing, but unless there's something being able to perceive something else, or something that appears to be something else, that recursive loop cannot be completed and there is no appearance. We could simply say that reality itself, on its most fundamental level, is a fourth dimensional object, and the way that fourth dimensional object pierces into our third dimension of physical or relative experience is through these appearances of form. And the way those tend to show up is, if there is one perceiving it, it begins to exist. It seems to be a recursive loop. There seems to be some sort of divine geometry in effect there. We also see this in the theory of relativity, that based on the perceived space, location and space of a perceiver, the experience can change. And they've actually proven this in a variety of different ways. One of them was to synchronize two clocks and to have one on a supersonic jet that flew around the entire planet and then landed on the same runway. And when they compared the time in those clocks, the clock that was on the jet that flew around the planet was actually a little bit slower than the one that remained on the ground. This is the nature of relativity. Relativity is just a fragment of a way to explain something that is actually really obvious and visceral in our experience. Everything is literal. All arising phenomena is self-defining. All arising expressions are self-defining. And what we begin to see is they're not self-defining apart. There needs to be a perceiver with the object in order to complete that loop. And when you start to recognize that, it has a visceral feel to it. It gets a lot more interesting from there. Because to recognize it is to somehow be creating it. It's almost like a co-creation. It is where the attention of what we are somehow seeing, even if we're assuming it to be separate, is meeting the attention of what is perceiving what is being seen. That particular point of contact right there, it becomes absolutely moot. And we can move attention absolutely into that exact so-called space, even though it's not really a space. It's not a space in reference to anything. It's something closer to an infinite space. You may have heard other pointings referring to the space between thoughts or the gap or the pause or stillness. This is what we're speaking to, that all self-defining phenomena is essentially moot because there is no point of contrast or comparison. And in every single experience that you have in the senses themselves, all of these experiences are moot. If you allow yourself to go as direct and as literal as possible to that point of contact. Nothing exists without an observer. All objects are created by both the perception and the attention of said object meeting there. It's interesting. And I know that probably will sound a little confusing, but there is infinite object and infinite form here, but it always appears as empty until there's one that's perceiving. And so we start to find ourselves in this continuum of experience, chicken or the egg, so to speak. Does it exist because there's one that's perceiving it? Or is there one perceiving it because it exists? Most often in our experience, it's safe to assume that we assume that it exists before there is one to perceive it. That seems to be how we interface with our relative reality on a regular basis. It seems to exist before there's one that perceives it. But we very rarely allow ourselves to step outside of that assumption and to see as if it exists at all before that attention meets the attention of perceiver. In other words, is it being created by the perception alone? This is one of the reasons that in this path we start to examine what we could just call perception. And we start to shake that up a little bit when we start getting into inquiry. Who am I? Where am I? These things. We're starting to shake up the assumptions, because what you will start to recognize is perception and assumption seem to go hand in hand. Beyond perception, in this direct experience, you will find something more akin to sensing. When we speak to direct experience, that's essentially where we're telling you to go. And initially, it seems to show up in body sensing. It shows up in externalized sensing and hearing and seeing and touching and tasting and smelling, and all of these particular pieces. And then it starts to show up in terms of what you could just call like an interoception, a perception of a rising sensational experience. And you will see that one of the most crucial aspects of that is a perception of location in the body, which is actually fine. Once you have a beat on the location of what's felt, then bringing attention to that point of contact, you will find that every time we reach a point of contact, there is an overlap. And in that overlapping experience, there is a penetration that occurs. And to allow attention to follow that penetration, we find ourselves in this seemingly fractalization of experience or reality. I know this is really wordy, and I'm doing my best not to create too much of a word salad in this. So, to simplify that, we could say on a sensational level, we have these containers of sensation or emotion. Maybe that's how it shows up first. And the encouragement for you is to engage with what's being presented as if it is fully true, with a subtle curiosity or intention to continue to penetrate, to find that point of contact, and to see if that point of contact somehow takes you inside of the experience. And I know that can be tricky, because there's not really an inside or an outside, but it can very much appear to be so. And so we just continue following those breadcrumbs. So to simplify a little bit, let's say an arising emotion comes up for you, something along the lines of frustration. So the mind will tell you, that's usually when we start to be aware of the experience. I am frustrated, or this is frustrating, or something along those lines. And then we can go to that container of experience. So let's say frustration seems to exist here in the solar plexus. There seems to be something that's detected here. We go to frustration as a container. with also the realization that frustration itself doesn't exist. It's not really even an object. There's an assumption there. It's almost like a second step away from something else. In other words, frustration is an interpretation of something else. So if there's a notion of something else, go to the something else in that way of penetration. So we bring attention into solar plexus. I locate in the body what seems to be the body. And then I feel this packet or this container of frustration. And then once I bring attention into the very contact of what seems like the outer edges of that experience of frustration, I begin to see an overlapping happening. And in that overlapping, that means there's something penetrating through that container, something in attention that is allowing closer access, so to speak. And so I move into that and I start to find maybe a group of sensations, maybe a singular sensation. Doesn't really matter how it appears, let it appear how it appears. And then I see some other truth. I have penetrated what was being invited, and then I have moved into something else, another breadcrumb. And in that breadcrumb, I find buzzing and maybe swirling sensations that tend to have flecks of heat and maybe some pressure. And so I allow myself to come into contact with any of those. If you cannot come into contact with all of them simultaneously, pick the one that stands out and then move to that. So let's just say it's a buzzing. So we move attention and allow it to fall. And what you might find here is it actually feels a little bit like a gravitational pull, pulling into buzzing. And we come into contact in this experience of buzzing. Meanwhile, watching these motions of thought and allowing them to course through and referring to them and then coming home if that's required. But stay close, stay at the point of contact of buzzing. And we move attention to that very point of contact of buzzing, and suddenly we start to recognize another overlapping in the buzzing. So we start to penetrate a little bit deeper. And in that experience, if we are doing this thoroughly, we will start to maybe realize or not realize, but you will probably have a sense that thoughts are being forgotten. They're not being grasped anymore. They may be coming up and falling away, but there's nothing tangible any longer about thought in the viscerality of this point of contact, this object of sensation. And so we move closer, and within that buzzing, we start to find something else, maybe a vast space or something that feels like an oceanicness or something that's like an abyss. Who knows? Just this is an example. And so we allow attention to penetrate into that, and we go to that point of contact again. And now I'm at this vast oceanic space, but I can feel where that point of contact seems to be, somehow perceiving it. And I'm resting with it, with that completely and fully until I feel that sense of overlapping again. I'm looking for an edge to see if there is an edge. And I find myself completely swept away in the experience. And oftentimes, and I'm simplifying this, but oftentimes that object that arises of sensation and that subject or perceiver that comes in and starts to examine point of contact, in that merging, this begins to happen and we find no thought, we find no self, we just find an infinitude of unbound consciousness in an utter and complete and total empty, yet somehow also full sense of this. Just a being that isn't centered, a being that isn't emanated from or away or toward, just something that is absolutely embedded in this fourth dimensional shape, something that on its outskirts and on its interior is exactly the same, something that is quantumly entangled, something that is absolutely a superposition. In the rendering of that experience, the rendering of what appears to be separate and the one who's perceiving it, that rendering collapses, and so there's no longer a sense of separation at all, no longer a one-apartness, yet a totality, a completeness. This is the way to explore this point of contact. This is the way to start to recognize where attention meets attention. And it seems like the reason we move into these internalized experiences is, for one, they're ubiquitous. For two, when we're really in contact with them, we find that there is no compatibility with sensation and thought that's attempting to model it and put it into a container. And so you might find more containers and more containers, essentially turtles all the way down, as we say, in an infinitude of this experience. Yet there will certainly be a point where it is as if you're swept away by the current of something, and there is no longer an orientation or an ownership or a grasping, and somehow completely, fully, absolutely here with no need to mitigate, control, modify, or otherwise adjust the experience. This is presence beyond a self. This is the realization of godliness. This is the realization of oneness, of completion, of totality. And in here we have further realizations of the hollowness of all these other seeming layers of existence. The hollowness of everything that appears to be an object in thought, an external object, and anything in sight. We start to recognize that everything is inherently this fourth dimensional shape. And the appearances, or the way that fourth dimensional shape seems to pierce through our third dimension of reality, is a sense of depth and object and space. And then the way it seems to pervade itself or penetrate into our two-dimensional mind is this linear sense of time, this past, present, future, and these two-dimensional objects of thought, the models of our three-dimensional reality. And once we have a very strong reconciliation with this fourth dimensional consciousness, this unbound experience, this untetheredness, it seems like it just becomes irrelevant if there is fifth, sixth, seventh dimension. All that becomes just kind of pointless to even worry about, because it becomes its own defining experience. And what I mean by defining experience is nothing that can actually be known, but something that is somehow completely obvious. It is so strange. And what it tends to bring to the surface for any of us that have had the intrepidness to approach it in such a way is an absolute sense of completion that can sometimes bring about an experience with tears or laughter, often both, because we instantly recognize the simplicity in all that actually is. And the rest is simply a game of form and compartmentalization and consequences and cause and effect relationships and linear time, when actually none of that on its most fundamental exists at all. This doesn't mean that we abandon these other aspects of what seems to be our existence. Thich Nhat Hanh said that if he could add an addendum to the Heart Sutra, he would say there is no being, which is that realization of no self, and he would also say there is no non-being, there's still a nose, akin to the pointings of the Heart Sutra. Somehow a paradox in that, and somehow those seem to fit elegantly. And while we cannot reconcile those things paradoxically in the mind, we somehow still recognize a foundational truth in the directness of experience. And what the pointing is here, and what I am offering you in every video, yet very directly in this video, is just the simple reminder that it is already here. It cannot be found, cannot be lost, it cannot be moved away from, because it is everything, including no thing. It is inherently impossible to understand in a two-dimensional space of mind, yet fourth dimensionally we somehow have absolute contact with that. Ultimately, it seems to point to there is no death, or we could otherwise say death isn't what you think it is. This endless transitional experience is somehow flowing out of itself and into itself simultaneously. Somehow indecipherably so. Somehow the inside is the outside and the outside is the inside. Somehow there's no boundary. It's infinite. It's basically impossible for the mind to understand. Yet we can start getting some hints of that in our experiences. So maybe we can start to meet life where it appears. We can start to experiment where attention meets attention and follow that overlapping into a deeply penetrating experience, to the point where there is no longer a point, to the point where we don't even recognize unboundness, or we recognize that we are here or gone, to the point where it begins to speak entirely for itself, and the simplicity of self-defining phenomena becomes rather clear. To the point where if we seemingly come back into this avatar of the body, we recognize that it is all inherently empty, but that still doesn't mean anything. It's just to see the nature of this reality, to see the operating code of the matrix itself, is to be so much in touch with something that is blatantly and obviously and ubiquitously here right now, not just at the end of the nose, but against the retina. And the rest of this is just a projection of experience where a perceiver's attention is meeting the attention of an object, and somehow those two things are not separate or different at all. And to recognize that through the engagement of experience itself, that somehow it is pulling you in every instant, to the point where there is no instant, there is no span any longer. It is somehow coalesced into an infinitely small singularity, and also blown apart to the point of endless, infinite, no boundary. It seems to be something like this. Come into contact with it. Everything is a portal. All things that appear are all things. And all of those are doorways into this exploration. The why is irrelevant. There is no why. The purpose is irrelevant. There is no purpose. It just is as it is. There is no extra step. It's fundamentally obvious now. So see if you can allow yourself to do that and explore. And if there's anything interesting that shows up, please report that in the comments, and we can start to discuss that and possibly continue pointing the way home, which, of course, is wherever you are, always. How could you not be here now? Even when you're there, you're here when you get there. Is there anywhere other than here? And I know these are still words and terms, yet hopefully the essence of this begins to ring true through the transmission of this video, through the resonance that you're beginning to feel. And from there, we can explore some further. So thank you for lending me those eyes and ears. You are always appreciated.